Hey, good morning. Thanks for joining my session, and thanks in advance for your listening. I'm Cori Shen. I'm the head of identity and fraud data science team at Equifax. So today, I'm going to present something that we do in Equifax to capture synthetic ID fraud using a very, very unique machine learning approach leveraging graph mining. So synthetic ID fraud. Synthetic ID fraud has been an uprising concern for several years. At the beginning, we just saw fraudsters stealing children's SSN, and they put fake ID around it, and then they pretend to be a real person, and they go ahead and steal money from the banks and business. And what happened is that in the last 2 years, we've been seeing a really major activity from synthetic ID frauds that they are going all out to attack the relief funds programs, such as PPP loans. And this is actually a really sad news, not only because synthetic ID frauds have been going up a lot, but also, this money is supposed to go to the people who need them, not going to the fraudsters' pocket. So when we see these activities, this is what I'm thinking. As a data scientist, right? So not only that we can solve it, but I think we should solve it for the reason that we should help people. However, it's easy to say than do because capturing synthetic ID fraud is really hard. One of the main reasons it's really hard is because nowadays fraudsters are getting really sneaky. They are able to create the fake IDs look just like a real person. So you're going to see the fake IDs that their personal information are matching to each other really well. And sometimes you're also going to see that the fake ID has a very well matching social media profile built up. So that's why finding synthetic ID is like finding a needle in a haystack. At the beginning, we're just trying to do something. Hey, when I saw an identity or when I saw a transaction around the ID, we're trying to capture the risk signal, which is fine. But then we realize it's not good enough for the reason I just explained. So that's why we turned our interest to start experiment and explore with graph mining. Because we really want to, at this point, we really want to find some hidden connections of synthetic identities that those hidden connections can only be discovered and exposed based on the second degree, third degree, or even fourth degree of separation on a graph network. So before I start, let me introduce some graph concepts and terminologies I'm going to use in this presentation. You're going to hear me talk about graph community. And you're going to also hear me talk about nodes, edges, and bridges. So here's an example, like visual example of a graph community. Graph communities are a set of nodes that they are connected to each other. A very cliche example, right? So people here, we can consider ourselves as a node. And why we're connecting, for example, we might be connecting to each other on LinkedIn. So if we are connecting to each other, then here you go, we build an edge, a link between you and me. And the bridge is simplified the connection that's two highly connected components that are linking to each other. It's like a bridge from A to B. All right, so just remember graph community, nodes, edges, and the bridges. I'm gonna mention this all the time in the next few slides. All right, so there are two types of graph structures we researched. Transaction graph and the primary authorized user abuse graph. Today, I'm going to focus on transaction graph because the second one do require the domain knowledge to explore. And here's the example of how we build transaction graph. We are using the consumer activity data to build this graph. So what does that mean for consumer activity data? It's like, hey, person going to, for example, Capital One to apply for a credit card. This is a consumer activity. And someone's going to Amazon.com to shop online on the merchant site. This is another consumer activity. Here in Equifax, we're able to collect all these online, offline, and mobile consumer activity transactions. So we are able to use those information to build our graph. For transaction graph structure, this is what we do. So if you look at it here, so first we are collecting the transaction graph. This is a kind of a row is a transaction. For example, a person, death waiter, applied at Capital One. And we put a transaction events as a node. And how we are connecting two nodes to each other, then we use their personal identifiable information. So for example, if we're saying one person is applying a card at Bank of America, another applying for a credit card at Capital One, and two people are using the same device, and this is how we are linking two nodes together. All right. So, as you can imagine, when we build our transaction graph this way, well, we're going to end up with lots of graph communities. Some communities are large, some communities are small. The essence of doing fraud detection on graph network is really to figure out a way to detect the fraudulent communities on a graph network. And how do we do that? Here's some secret sauce. So what I'm trying to discover, the next slide is actually a really important slide because I need to, I don't know what's going on. So I think there's something strange here. You can look at this slide, it's totally blank. So you can imagine, those are some data-driven insights. Just imagine that. I'm trying to see if I can talk with my words. So there are a few secret sauce. Number one is, although we're going to see fraudsters do all crazy stuff here and there, right? If you look at the individual events, like, oh, what they are doing, what's going on. But what we find out is that when we are building those graph communities, there are few common patterns are always showing up on graph fraudulent community. So the pattern number one is that no matter what they do, on a given fraudulent graph community, we always see a bridge type of connection. So there's always a bridge structure in there. Why is that? Because when fraudsters operates, there's always a point of compromise. So this point of compromise could be somewhere that your credit card information was taken. Could also be a fake SSN number was built and the fraudsters are using putting all kinds of fake IDs on top of that. And that point of compromise can also be an address that fraudster uses to receive money. Because when they apply for a credit card or loan, so they're going to get money, they need to have some place to receive it. So those things are we call the point of compromise. As you can see, the reason the bridge structure exists today because of this point of compromise. So that's number one, really important information. Number two is that we find typically centrality type of graph-based measures are highly correlated to fraud occurrence. So what does that mean for centrality type of graph measures? Is centrality, as you can imagine, there's a graph, right? So let me go back to, at least you can see some graph. So, all right. So if you can see this graph here, this, the graph example is actually the real fraudulent community here. The centrality, typically in the general term on in the graph world, centrality measures evaluates the influence of a node in the graph. For a fraud use case, this influence represents the fraud risk. So what does that mean is that when we are showing a node with high centrality measures, it is very likely this node carries a super high fraud risk. And also, it's very likely this node is the point of compromise. So that's number two. And with these two really useful information, and I meant to show you some really, like this is a true data-driven summary. It's showing, hey, you know, when we are looking at different community size, when community size is bigger, the fraud risk is higher. And when we are looking at the betweenness centrality, the betweenness centrality is one of the things that we use to build the bridge nodes. right? So when those betweenness centrality index become really high, and the associated fraud risk is really high. And I also mean to show you another centrality measure is called neighborhood connectivity. A neighborhood connectivity actually evaluates how many neighbors, like graph neighbors, that a node is linking to, and it also evaluates how busy your neighbors are. Because as you can imagine, if there's a fraudulent nodes, the neighborhood connectivity value usually tend to be very high. And actually, I put into a scatter plot between good people and fake ID. And then in the scatter plot, you're gonna see how many neighbors a node links to, and how busy their neighbors are. And you just imagine, this is actually really fascinating. When we first explored this, is that we didn't really do anything, but when we put those information in a chart to visualize it, we are seeing a really clear cut between good people and bad people. And bad people, as you can imagine, they always lay on, hey, the ones with high, with more neighbor connects with more neighbors, and their neighbors more busy. Why they're busy? Because the bad guys are doing bad things all the time. They are actually really hardworking people. They like work 24/7. Oh, here you go. What's going on today? All right, so that's it. This is those three charts are the ones I'm trying to show you about. Like, say, this is a very simple example. The red line represents the fraud risk, and right here is the distribution of the community size from left to right. Higher the worse, right? So you can see this is really high, and the fraud risk is really high. This is a betweenness measure. You can see, when betweenness measure is really high here, and the fraud risk is much like 10 times higher than average. And this is the scatter plot I have to explain to you. That you can see the red dot is bad people, good dot, green dot is good people, and it's very, very clear cut. I'm not even faking those data. This is something we explored almost 2 years ago. This is really fascinating. All right. So at this point, let's do a recap. So let's do a recap. What you learned so far? We know, okay, so graph mining is really useful to discover the hidden insights. And we know that when a graph community is large, it tends to carry high risk. We also know that when the graph community is showing the bridge type of connection, it also tends to carry high risk. And we also know that when a graph community showing that they have abnormal and super high or super outlier centrality measured, it also carries high risk. So now the question is, hey, you already learned all this great knowledge. What are you going to do to detect the fraudulent community? Here's our approach. So I'm sharing all the great information here. So what we do here first is that every day, we are using about 100 million transactions every day, and we're just building the graph network, the transaction graph network. And typically at this stage, you only you're going to build a really large graph network, something look like this, right? So everything's put together. And then after you have this, usually we're saying about using 100 million transactions, we're saying a graph network with close to 1 billion edges. And then what we do is we apply the graph clustering algorithm, such as pscan. By doing so, we are able to flag every single graph community on this graph network. After that, what we do next is that we actually, remember, it's a semi-supervised learning, right? So when we always start with very small, very sparse, but a handful of known fraud cases or suspect fraud cases. And what we can do is we can actually label the nodes based on whether they are known frauds or suspect frauds. Known frauds is very obvious, right? So you may ask, hey, what is suspect frauds? Suspect frauds is something that no one confirmed, hey, this is a fraudulent transaction for us. But based on our domain knowledge, that we know when this signal show, it is super risky. For example, a very significant suspect the fraud signal for synthetic ID is that we actually know when fraudsters are building fake ID, they like to, for some reason, they like to shuffle the last 4 digits of SSN. And they would just keep building more fake IDs. And this pattern, we call them SSN tumbling. So SSN tumbling is one of the famous suspect frauds that we're using here in Equifax. All right. So now we have the graph network, and we have every single graph community defined, and we are able to put some known fraud and suspect fraud labels there to the nodes. And next part is really heavy lifting computing happen, is that for every single community, we compute the centrality measures. So here's our, we are computing 8 different measures, and here's are some example we compute. For example, degree count, neighborhood connectivity index, the local clustering coefficient, betweenness index, and things in that nature. And after that, we also flags the communities with bridge nodes type of structure. So next step, what we do is that we are, for every single community, we are able to create something we call community risk index. What we do is we are combining the centrality measures, known fraud counts, suspected fraud node counts, and the bridge nodes counts all together, and we put them together to define as the community risk index. Once we have the community risk index, the rest of the job is very easy. We just sort the risk index from high to low, and we're able to find the fraudulent communities with 2 conditions. One is that these communities has to have very high index number. The second is that these communities have to have the bridge nodes connection. So matter of fact, once we did all this, our mission is accomplished because right now we actually flagged a list of the communities that we deem to be fraudulent. Actually, we can do a little bit more. Sometimes we, not only we're giving our customers and users the list of the community, but we also were able to assign a quote-unquote fraud score on every single node for a given fraudulent community. The benefit of doing that is that many times there are fraud investigators in the bank. They're going to review the cases. They're going to do more verification process. So give them a fraud score rank order for each node. It's really going to help their job much easier. Okay, all right. So this concludes our approach for today. Now I'm going to just share, do a quick sharing about our experimentation R&D journey. As you can see here, that we actually this is like 2 years of R&D work, and now we are very lucky. We're working with a company to put our graph network in production today on our Google Cloud platform. So all these are the tools, algorithms, APIs, and software we tried in the last 2 years. Okay. So before I end my presentation, I'm still gonna plan to show you a demo. And from this 1-minute demo, you're gonna see how we actually discovered a super risky fraudulent community. So what we do is that we're there are 4 people totally separate. No one knows what's going on. And then we start building the transaction graph network. And then we actually start finding the SSN tumbling risk. And we're able to compute the different centrality measures. And in the end, we actually find out this is a real case, but I did mask the PII here. So and in the end, we actually find out that this community carries a super high community risk index. That's why we actually flagged everybody of them, and we parsed all the transactions from these people. We indeed save a lot of money for our customer. So I think we have almost 4 minutes. Any questions? All right.
Bridge nodes are kind of a fuzzy call, and I wonder how you decide on the threshold for betweenness centrality or closeness centrality to decide what is a bridge node and what isn't.
Right. So that's a really good question. It is. You're right. It is fuzzy call. Actually, not only that, but also how we select the cut for the community risk index is also. I would say it's based on 3 things. One is data driven, Because we start with some known fraud data, small, but we start with some. And we are working with 100 million transactions, so you can imagine, right? So we really just do a data-driven approach. That's most important. And after the data-driven approach, we say, hey, you know, we defined a few thresholds for example, bridge connection. And we apply this to some totally brand new transaction. And then we verify with fraud investigators, say, hey, does our assumption make sense? So that's our iterative approach. There's no, to me, at this point, to me, there's no silver bullet. We just do experiment and we say, hey, the thresholds, we feel comfortable. And the beauty is that because we're putting this into production, we can have the fraud feedback loop, and we can keep checking our thresholds at regular basis every quarter to adjust. All right, so, yeah.
Out of the case you marked as a fraud, how many are?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So it's a really good question. So what we typically do is, you guys are probably familiar, it's kind of like out-of-time validation. So when we build a scrap community, we always split it to new customers. For example, maybe just Verizon. They come to us, we say, hey, we have this tool you want to try. We want them to try. Because their transaction, we don't have them on our network, right? So, and we want but we have network built using somebody else's transaction. Like maybe use AT&T, Bank of America, right? Like the PNC, Capital One, whatever, right? So we use that transaction and we build our network. And we say, hey, these are fraudulent. And Verizon comes in, they put their transaction in, and then we score their nodes and community. We say, hey, these are risky. And then they can verify. So usually, if it's top risky communities, the accuracy is pretty high. So usually above 50% and 60% for sure. And sometimes we even find out this. They think, hey, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with this person. But it's actually synthetic ID. Because sometimes it's really sneaky. Like it's really just hard to tell. But we have pretty good success rate doing this work. All right, one simple question. One last question. Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation and the sharing. So this is the last question, but I don't think it will be a short question. So basically, you mentioned
yes.
that you have 2 years R&D, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder what is the biggest challenge you have, and what is a big lesson you learned, as well as how you proceed to create the graph model database to store the large amount of data if you don't have this infrastructure in your team before. Yeah, thank you.
You're right, but we'll catch up later. So a couple of things I learned quickly is that came up with hypothesis, and verifying hypothesis need patience. Because we know what might be going on, but we really don't know what's going to come out from that. Right? So the first 6 months, we're like really struggling to verify those hypotheses. Nothing's showing up. So patience is very important. Second thing is actually biggest challenge is computational challenge. Because as you probably remember, we experienced the GraphX on Spark and also Sparkling Graph. They're kind of okay, but then when we are getting into, for example, a network with close to 1 billion address, there's some centrality measures we cannot really compute. For example, closeness. It's just really hard to compute. So that is something we spent quite a long time to I would say accomplish. That's actually the biggest challenge. That's why we decided to work with a third party. They have graph computation engineer, and we can partner together to build a real scalable graph database for production usage. All right.
Thank you so much, Cori. Thank you so much.